My impression reading stuff today is that economists, when they saw this, they're like, great choice by the Nobel Prize committee. I saw Paul Krugman said, I was actually surprised they hadn't already won it. Yeah. But no, I don't think these two were household names. I was not familiar with their work before this morning, so I'll just throw that right out there.
There's a lot that goes into contract theory, and we can't adequately boil it down in the short space that we've got to discuss it. But Holmström, I noticed, is being recognized in part for his work on, which is a subset of contract theory, that executives should be compensated, right, in part by a company's stock price. Which I think we've learned since then can be dangerous.
The gist of all their work seems to boil down to how do you align incentives between two parties that have different interests. And so that's why it obviously applies to things like executive pay. How do you encourage, you want to reward a CEO for performance, but you don't want them to take excessive risks. You also don't want them to get paid a lot of money just because the entire industry had a good year. But it also applies to other areas. He's done a lot of work in insurance. They've also done a lot of work with how does a government deal with privatizing industry? Like a private prison, how do you deal with that? And so I think that this particular reward really speaks to a lot of the big public policy questions that people have been interested in several years from now, which I suspect has something to do with why they won.
Right, exactly. And apart from, winning it for the umbrella of contract theory, Holmström, again, has done a lot of work on moral hazard, which, as you say, is aligning incentives and so forth, but it became a kind of a catchphrase during the financial crisis, right? That's when we all started talking about moral hazard as if we had always done it all our lives. And he's continuing to work on issues related to liquidity, which will be extraordinarily important, most likely in the coming years.
There was a fascinating paper that Holmström wrote. It was published by the BIS in 2015, looking at money markets specifically and debt. And, post-crisis, there's all this effort to bring transparency to debt markets and money markets and so forth. And his actual argument is that that's a bad idea. He says debt markets are fundamentally different than stock markets. And if we try to turn them into equities, it's not going to work. What makes debt markets work and which makes money markets work is actually that they're low information markets, that there's a lot of collateral, you don't really need to do a deep dive examination of the borrower, and that some of these reforms may have perverse incentives. So some counterintuitive results from.
Well, you know what? One of the reasons they're being recognized for contract theory is that nobody thought that much about contract theory before the 1970s.
And they essentially invented it.
And now that they've identified the incentives, what's happened since the 1970s? We've had all of these financial crises.
Absolutely.
Yeah.